In the spring of 1212, something extraordinary swept across Europe, a religious fervor so powerful that it sent thousands of people marching toward the Mediterranean Sea. But this wasn't a traditional crusade led by knights and kings. This was a crusade of the desperate, the faithful, and the young. A movement sparked by two boy preachers claiming direct messages from God. What followed was one of history's most heartbreaking journeys, tens of thousands of children and poor peasants marching across an entire continent, driven by absolute faith and ultimately betrayed by greed, reality, and the cold indifference of fate. In this episode, we explore the Children's Crusade of 1212, a tragedy so profound that medieval chroniclers couldn't explain it and modern historians still struggle to comprehend how an entire generation of young people could vanish into the machinery of medieval exploitation. The story begins with two boys, both claiming divine inspiration. In Germany, a young preacher named Nicholas of Cologne emerged from the Rhine region around 1212, preaching that God had chosen him to lead a peaceful crusade to the Holy Land. Nicholas was charismatic, convincing, and, most importantly, he offered something that the established church could not: direct divine guidance, unfiltered by bishops or popes. Across in France, an even younger figure appeared, Stephen of Cloyes, a shepherd boy only 12 years old. Stephen claimed that Jesus himself, disguised as a pilgrim, had appeared to him and given him a letter to deliver to King Philip II of France. This letter, Stephen preached, contained God's plan for a new crusade. These weren't wild-eyed fanatics. They were believable. They were young, they spoke with conviction, and they offered certainty in an uncertain world. In the early 13th century, the official crusades had become expensive, distant, and largely the domain of wealthy nobles. But these two boys offered something radically different: a crusade for everyone. For the poor. For the young. For those who had nothing but faith. The response was staggering. Bands of children began gathering around Nicholas and Stephen. But they weren't alone. As the movements grew, they attracted thousands of adults, the poor, the displaced, the religiously fervent, the desperate. People who saw in this youth-led crusade a chance for redemption, salvation, or simply escape from their grinding poverty. By the time both movements were in full swing, tens of thousands of people were marching toward the Mediterranean. Some estimates suggest Nicholas gathered around 20,000 followers. Stephen's movement may have swelled to 30,000 at its peak. They were called crusaders, but they looked like refugees. Nicholas led his followers south toward the Mediterranean, planning to reach the Holy Land by crossing the Alps into Italy. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. The Alps in summer are brutal for trained soldiers with supplies and experience. For tens of thousands of children, adolescents, and poor peasants carrying minimal provisions and minimal understanding of what they faced, the mountains became a death trap. As the ragged column climbed higher, the horror began. Children collapsed from exhaustion on mountain passes. Others fell victim to exposure as nights grew freezing cold. Some simply lost heart, turned back, or wandered into the wilderness. Starvation claimed those who ran out of food. Disease spread through the packed, unwashed masses. Of the roughly 20,000 who set out with Nicholas, approximately 2 out of every 3 never made it across the mountains. Think about that statistic. 2/3 of 20,000 is roughly 13,000 people dead. The vast majority were children or teenagers. The few thousand survivors who straggled down into the Italian port city of Genoa in late August 1212 were skeletal, traumatized, and broken. They had marched across an entire continent and survived one of history's most brutal mountain crossings, only to face a bitter disappointment. When they reached the sea, they expected a miracle. Medieval accounts describe the scene: thousands of exhausted, starving children standing on the Genoese shore, looking out at the Mediterranean. They truly believed that God would part the waters as he had done for Moses at the Red Sea. They genuinely expected the sea to open, creating a dry path to Jerusalem. The waters did not part. The realization dawned slowly, then spread through the crowd like a wave of despair. There would be no miracle. They were stranded in a foreign city with no money, no supplies, and no way forward. Many of the crusaders, broken by the journey and betrayed by their faith, gave up. They accepted the charity of Genoese citizens and settled in the city, their crusade finished before it truly began. But Nicholas refused to accept defeat. He traveled to the nearby port of Pisa, searching for any way to continue his mission. There, a few opportunistic ship captains agreed to provide passage, though historians debate whether this actually occurred or became embellished in later retellings. A handful of Nicholas's followers may have boarded ships headed toward the Holy Land. But Nicholas himself attempted another crossing of the Alps to gather more followers. He vanished from history on that return journey. Years later, it emerged that Nicholas's father, blamed by grieving families for his son's role in leading thousands of children to their deaths, was captured and hanged. While Nicholas's crusade was falling apart in Italy, Stephen of Cloyes was leading an even larger movement across France. At its peak, Stephen commanded perhaps 30,000 followers, a force larger than many medieval armies. They were mostly poor, mostly young, bound together by religious fervor and the charisma of a shepherd boy who claimed to speak for God. King Philip II of France, however, was not impressed. When Stephen marched through France, the king didn't see a holy crusade. He saw a mob. He issued an order: the crusade was to disperse immediately. His subjects were to return to their homes. But Stephen and his core followers refused to obey. Instead, they pressed onward toward Marseille, the great Mediterranean port on France's southern coast. By late June 1212, the exhausted, hungry column reached the sea. And there, something happened that would seal their fate. Two local merchants, Hugh the Iron and William of Poskers, appeared with an offer that seemed like divine intervention. They had 7 ships, they said. They would carry Stephen's crusaders across the Mediterranean to Jerusalem. The cost? Nothing. God had put it on their hearts to help. It seemed like a miracle. God was providing. After months of marching, starving, and struggling, divine providence had finally arrived. Several thousand of Stephen's followers boarded the ships. They didn't know they were walking into a slave trader's trap. Instead of sailing east toward Jerusalem, the ships turned south, toward North Africa. The merchants had no intention of delivering crusaders to the Holy Land. They were slave traders, and they had captured thousands of young people to sell on the markets. The journey itself was a nightmare. 2 of the 7 ships encountered a storm near Sardinia and sank, drowning everyone aboard. The survivors who reached North Africa faced an even worse fate. They were herded into slave markets in Algeria and Egypt, stripped naked, and sold to the highest bidder. Children who had left Europe believing they were fulfilling God's will found themselves in chains, being auctioned off to Muslim and Jewish slave merchants, and bitter irony that medieval chroniclers could not ignore. None of Stephen's followers ever reached the Holy Land. Modern historians debate some of the details. They argue about whether the Children's Crusade actually included as many young people as the name suggests, or whether most participants were poor adolescents and adults. They question whether exact numbers can ever be known, given the fragmentary medieval records. But the essence of the tragedy is undeniable. In 1212, an unsanctioned, spontaneous crusade led by idealistic youth, whether children or poor youth, collapsed in starvation, death, and brutal exploitation. The scale is almost incomprehensible. Nicholas's movement lost approximately 13,000 people in the Alps alone. Stephen's movement, split among those who dispersed, those who died on the journey, and those who were enslaved, likely lost the vast majority of its followers. Conservative estimates suggest that tens of thousands died, vanished into slavery, or simply disappeared into medieval history. These were the most vulnerable members of society, the poor, the young, the desperate. People with no power, no resources, no protection. And they were sacrificed to a combination of religious fervor, opportunistic exploitation, and the brutal reality of medieval life. Medieval chroniclers were horrified. They wrote accounts of the Crusade with a mixture of fascination and moral outrage. But over time, as the story passed from monk to monk, account to account, details became embellished. The tragedy became increasingly romanticized, a tale of faithful youth marching towards something noble, even if they failed. The reality was far darker. It was organized exploitation of the young and poor, enabled by false religious promises and predatory merchants. To understand how this catastrophe occurred, we need to understand the religious and social context of 1212. The Crusades had dominated European consciousness for over a century. In 1095, Pope Urban II had called for the First Crusade, and suddenly liberating Jerusalem from Muslim rule became Christianity's central organizing principle. Crusades had been mounted repeatedly, some successful, many catastrophic. By 1212, the crusading impulse was still powerful, but it had changed. The official crusades of kings and nobles had become expensive, distant, and often unsuccessful. But more importantly, the Church had not called for a new crusade. The official Christian hierarchy was not mobilizing for Jerusalem. Into this gap stepped Nicholas and Stephen, young visionaries claiming direct divine communication. They offered something the established Church could not: certainty, immediacy, and accessibility. Their crusade was for everyone, not just nobles. It required only faith, not money or military training. For the poor especially, this was transformative. For the first time, they were told that they could be crusaders. They could achieve salvation. They mattered to God's plan. The religious fervor was genuine. The faith was real. But it collided with a brutal reality. Medieval Europe had no infrastructure to support a mass migration of tens of thousands of people. There were no supply lines, no logistical planning, no way to feed and shelter such enormous numbers on a long journey. And there were predators waiting to exploit the vulnerable. The merchants who enslaved Stephen's followers weren't anomalies, they were part of a functioning medieval system. Slavery was common. Poor people were vulnerable. If you could capture them, you could sell them. It was business. Nicholas and Stephen had awakened genuine religious faith in tens of thousands. But they had no ability to protect those followers from starvation, exposure, and exploitation. The gap between their spiritual promises and the material reality of medieval life was lethal. The Children's Crusade disappeared from immediate historical memory almost as quickly as it occurred. The Church never officially acknowledged it as a legitimate crusade. Medieval chroniclers recorded it in their monastic chronicles, but often with embarrassment or moral confusion. How could they explain how God allowed tens of thousands of faithful, including children, to die or be enslaved? Over centuries, the story was gradually embellished. It became a tale of pure youth and faith, a romantic tragedy rather than a catastrophe born from exploitation and neglect. Modern retellings often soften the most brutal elements. But the historical record is clear: this was a disaster created by the intersection of religious fervor, social desperation, logistical incompetence, and predatory greed. It stands as perhaps the most tragic folly of the entire age of Crusades, a cautionary tale about what happens when visionary idealism meets harsh material reality with no protection for the vulnerable. The Children's Crusade teaches us several bitter lessons. First, that religious certainty, however genuine, cannot substitute for practical wisdom and preparation. Second, that the young and poor are uniquely vulnerable to exploitation, even when the exploitation is wrapped in spiritual language. Third, that good intentions are not sufficient to protect people from harm. And fourth, that history remembers the noble stories but often forgets the ordinary people who died in the machinery of those stories. Today, the Children's Crusade is remembered as a historical curiosity, an odd chapter in the story of medieval religious fervor. Movies and books have romanticized it. Some modern retellings treat it as inspiring, a story of young faith against the world. But for those who lived it, it was not inspiring. It was catastrophic. The 13,000 children who died in the Alps didn't achieve anything. They didn't reach Jerusalem. They didn't convert Muslims. they didn't fulfill any divine purpose. They simply died, exhausted and starving, on a mountain they had no business crossing in the first place. The thousands who boarded ships in Marseille expecting to reach the Holy Land instead ended up on slave markets, their faith weaponized against them by merchants who saw only opportunity. The Children's Crusade is a tragedy not because it failed, but because it reveals something uncomfortable about how power works in any era. The vulnerable are sacrificed first, their suffering is quickly forgotten, and their story is eventually rewritten into something nobler than the brutal reality they endured. Medieval chroniclers, writing centuries later, mourned the lost children and were horrified by the exploitation. They couldn't fully explain how God allowed it to happen. We, with historical distance, can see the machinery more clearly. And that clarity should inspire not nostalgia for an imagined romantic past, but determination to protect the vulnerable from those who would exploit their faith, their hope, and their youth. The Children's Crusade reminds us that history's greatest tragedies are often the ones we've learned to forget.